Welcome to the Talk About Teddy podcast, our conversations exploring the world of Theodore Roosevelt. I'm your host, Kurt Skinner, and I'm joined as ever by my good pal and co-host, Larry Marple.
Hello, Kurt.
Hey, we've been hosting this podcast for a little over a year now, and we've finally reached our 25th episode.
Bully.
Bully for us, yeah.
I know, it's been a great experience getting to talk with so many wonderful people in the TR community, from authors and historians, the Museum and National Park Service staff, everyone at all the sites, from the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation, the TR Center, and the Theodore Roosevelt Association. I mean, we could go on and on.
Yeah, it's been, a labor of love for us,
yes.
I think, right?
It is.
A hobby that we both really enjoy, and I feel like we've gained a whole lot this year with all the new friendships that we've made over the past year, and I hope that we've contributed, at least in some small way, to that community of Ted heads out there. Yeah,
well, I knew each time we speak with someone, I learned so much from them. It's been amazing. Now, saying that, doing the podcast, it's not without its monetary costs, at least the way we've chosen to do it.
Right.
So, our audience may not know we have recurring costs for the podcast hosted on a service called Podbean, and the remote recording software we use is called Squadcast. And our website host, Podpage. Each one has annual fees.
Right. So to help with the costs of putting on this podcast, we've created a new way for listeners to support the Talk About Teddy. So if you feel like supporting the creative content that goes into this podcast, you can now go to buymeacoffee.com/talkaboutteddy, or just simply click on the yellow coffee cup icon on our website, talkaboutteddy.com. So this Buy Me a Coffee, it's an easy way to give, a simple way to make a one-time donation, or if you are so inclined to give something on an ongoing basis, there's an option for that too. So given TR's well-known love for coffee, this Buy Me a Coffee seemed to us like a very Rooseveltian way to support this podcast.
I know, when you read some of the books, there's accounts of TR consuming about a gallon of coffee a day. And one of my favorite quotes is by his son, Ted Jr., who once remarked that Father was very fond of coffee and always had a special cup. It was so large, it was more in the nature of a bathtub.
That's great. So we hope TR would approve of the support of this, and seriously, for all of our listeners out there, we really appreciate all of the all the support we've received in person and by email, and just really appreciate the support that you've had for the podcast, and we have every intention on keeping it going at least for another year.
Yes, Kurt, I agree. We couldn't be doing this without everyone's support and encouragement. So thank you to everyone out there.
Welcome back to part 2 of the TR's Parks series. Really pleased to say the friend of the podcast, retired Park Superintendent Valerie Naylor, is with us. Welcome back, Valerie.
Thank you very much.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you, Larry.
So Valerie, we kind of dreamed this series up when we started talking with you about wouldn't it be interesting to look at all of TR's parks in a sort of a geographic way. And so I guess we would call this the Southwestern Parks edition.
That's correct. And there are a lot of Southwestern parks to talk about, so that makes it exciting.
So we're primarily looking at Arizona and New Mexico here, but we're also going to be throwing in a southwestern corner of Colorado site as well, and kind of bookending the show here with a couple of national parks. So maybe we could talk about kind of what's the impetus here for getting all of these southwestern parks established in the first place. What do they have in common? Larry, what would you say?
All of them are cultural sites with dozens of different native tribes that called this their homeland or used these as sacred sites or, for ceremonies. That's what mostly this area is.
And a lot of them were sites that were built by the ancestral Pueblo people whose descendants still live in the area today. So it's an interesting region, and there's lots to see. And Theodore Roosevelt created a lot of national monuments in the Southwest to protect the antiquities, hence the Antiquities Act, which you might want to talk about a little bit.
Yeah. So in TR's book that he wrote later in his life, Book Lovers, Holidays, and the Open, he talked about Arizona and New Mexico being an anthropologist's dreamland, yes. Which that's kind of a neat term. But he was really joined, I guess, in this effort by his primary conservation friend in the Congress, U.S. Representative John Lacey from Iowa. So you've got this Civil War veteran from Iowa who just takes this tremendous interest in the cultural and architectural, scientific remains of the American Southwest, and really is kind of a driving factor.
And with the Antiquities Act, it says that the President of the United States is authorized in his discretion to declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic and scientific interest that are situated upon the lands owned or controlled by the government of the United States to be national monuments, and may reserve as a part thereof parcels of land, the limits of which in all cases shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with proper care and management of the objects to be protected.
That's right. And every president, except for 3, since Theodore Roosevelt, has used the Antiquities Act to protect lands and waters. So it's a very significant act and a very important act. The Antiquities Act was passed in June of 1906, but it's important to note that Theodore Roosevelt established a national park prior to any of the national monuments that he established using the Antiquities Act. Now, you may remember that there were 5 national parks already when Theodore Roosevelt took office, and he doubled the size of the national park system by adding 5 more national parks. And as a reminder, too, to our listeners, it takes an act of Congress to establish a national park, but as Larry said, a president can proclaim a national monument. So the Antiquities Act was proclaimed in June of 1906, but later that month, Congress, with the support of Theodore Roosevelt and the signature of Theodore Roosevelt, established a national park in the Southwest, in the southwestern corner of Colorado, Mesa Verde National Park, which most people are probably familiar with. And that was established on June 29th, 1906. And it was the 5th of the 5 national parks that Theodore Roosevelt established during his presidency. So it was his last national park, but he had many national monuments to come after that.
Yeah, it's got a Colorado tie-in here as well with the women's group. Virginia McClurg took this real active interest in seeing that these southwestern cultural sites got preserved and protected from looting, and started a group called the Colorado Cliff Dwellers Association, women's group.
Yes, Virginia McClurg and also Lucy Peabody were very involved in that, and they worked with the Ute tribe, which claims that area as their homeland. And so what was really significant about Mesa Verde is that it was the first national park of the 10 first ones, that was set aside primarily for its cultural resources. The other 9 parks, the 4 that Theodore Roosevelt established and the 5 others that were already parks when he became president, were set aside for scenery and natural resources, but not for cultural. And so Mesa Verde was the first. And that really started a long line of Antiquities Act proclamations to preserve cultural sites in the Western United States.
Many of the cultural sites had been, for a better term, looted. People coming in, selling quite a few of the artifacts to European collectors and trying to get as many pieces of pottery or whatever that they could. So they thought the best way to do it was to ravage these sites. And so thankfully they were able to be preserved.
Absolutely. And I think this is really a case where there would be nothing left today if those areas had not been set aside as as national monuments, and in the case of Mesa Verde as a national park. Mesa Verde has 4,500 archaeological sites, including very famous cliff dwellings that I think everybody has seen pictures of. There are thousands of artifacts. People lived there from about 550 to the year 1300. This is a long occupation by the ancestral Puebloans. And so there's so much there. And we're so fortunate that Theodore Roosevelt and the Congress at that point did set it aside as a national park.
It's kind of a common story with a lot of these, right? It just takes years and years of persistent effort. But I think that this is Roosevelt's nationalism rising up here. He was so upset that especially there were European archaeologists coming in and just carting away crate loads back to museums in Europe. But, a lot of Americans, I think, at that turn of the century just didn't really value ancient native cultures. And so it was kind of a hard sell with the public until they began to see just how interesting, how well preserved some of these cliff dwellings were.
Exactly. Mesa Verde has some of the most amazing cliff dwellings that are preserved there that people can tour or look at from a distance. And that's why the photos of Mesa Verde are so common, because it is such a spectacular place. It's also a very green place. I mean, Mesa Verde means green table. There's a lot of trees there, and it's a great place to be. It is a busy park at times, but it can also be a fairly quiet place. And I really have enjoyed my visits there in the past. So I think anyone that's interested in any of the history of the ancestral Puebloans or just wants to see a beautiful portion of the world should visit Mesa Verde.
In our research, you mentioned it's a popular park. They get about 500,000 visitors a year.
And surprisingly, you can walk around a goodly amount of the ruins. They've got certain portions roped off. You can't climb up into some of the higher reaches, but certainly you can get a feel for the living situations being up on the cliffs. It's pretty impressive.
And you can do as much or as little as you want to. You can drive around, or you can hike, or you can walk to some of the ruins and take a tour with a park ranger.
Yeah.
So most parks have something for everybody, no matter what your ability or what your interest. You can concentrate on what interests you in each park. And it's not the same for everybody, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be. So in the Southwest, after Theodore Roosevelt and the Congress established Mesa Verde National Park, Theodore Roosevelt went on to establish quite a few national monuments. And his national monuments started on December 8, 1906. And that's an important date for three different national park areas because he established three different monuments on that date. El Morro, which we'll talk about, Montezuma Castle, and Petrified Forest. And nobody knows which proclamation he signed first. Now, the superintendents of El Morro have always told me theirs was first. For sure, had to be. It just had to be. But nobody really knows which of the three was the first one that he set aside. But we'll say El Morro. We'll talk about El Morro first, as it was, it was his second, third, or fourth national monument after Devil's Tower in Wyoming, which we will talk about in a future podcast. And El Morro is really an interesting place. El Morro means headland or promontory. And I don't know if either of you or our listeners have been there, but it is in New Mexico. It's fairly isolated, and it's a very interesting place. It's a watering hole, and so people stop there for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's west of Grants, New Mexico. There's a sandstone wall there, and it has carvings from the ancestral Pueblo people. It has carvings from Spanish travelers and explorers, and it has carvings from American travelers. And there are thousands of carvings in this rock, these inscriptions, from petroglyphs to more modern carvings. Mm-hmm. And if you can imagine all the stories those tell or could tell of all the people that passed through El Morro.
And you had some of the visitors, into the 1800s, right, who are writing their names alongside ancient petroglyphs.
Exactly. Inscription rock. Anytime, the Puebloans started with that maybe in the 1200s. And then we hope that writing mostly ended by the 1800s. We don't want anyone writing on it today, of course. But it is such an amazing place. But one thing that I really like about El Morro is not just to look at all of the inscriptions and walk along the base of it, but to climb up on top of it. And there's a trail called the Headland Trail that goes over the top. It's not very long. It's only about 2 miles. It climbs up and over, and it is, I think, one of the best short hikes in the whole national park system. It is just gorgeous. The views from there, the sandstone, the plants, everything about it. I love hiking over that place. And if I'm ever near there, I will hike over it again. So I definitely suggest that visitors to that area do more than just look at all the inscriptions and think about the waterhole, but also go over the top and see the views and how important that environment is there at El Morro.
Yeah, I'm kind of ashamed to say that I passed this one up, getting between the Grand Canyon and into New Mexico. So I'm going to have to circle back and get that one. All right. So after El Morro, what if we're moving chronologically through the national monuments, what would be next on the list?
Well, we don't know that because there were 3 established on one day, the fabulous December 8th, 1906. But we can talk about Montezuma Castle in Camp Verde, Arizona. And that's an interesting place to visit for sure. I had been there many years before I went there to look at it from the standpoint of Theodore Roosevelt. And when I went back, which was during the COVID pandemic, I was just amazed by it. I remember it just being something up on the hill. And when I went there, I couldn't believe it was even real. It almost looks like you're in some kind of a painting. And it is not a castle. And it has nothing to do with Montezuma at all. That's just a name that was given. But it's a 20-room dwelling, and it's up on the cliff, and you just look up at it in awe. And then not far from it is a kind of a apartment building. It had 45 rooms in it. And that's where these folks lived. And the folks that lived, the Sinawa people that lived at Montezuma Castle were farmers. They were into agriculture there, and there's water down below. They weren't without water, which is what Sinawa means.
Yeah.
They had water and they farmed. And so they were there for quite a long time because they had such a great place. And so it's not a park that takes a long time to visit, but it's a place that you should certainly give some strong thought and consideration when you're walking along the trail, thinking about the people that lived and made a living there off of a creek and in a beautiful place where they did have some protection by being way up on the cliff.
You mentioned that they were farmers and they prospered and had a sophisticated culture with apartment buildings, but then they vanished. Do the archaeologists, do they know why?
I sure don't think so. I think that's true for a lot of these cultures in the American Southwest, that they stayed in a place for a certain number of years, whether it be 30 years or 300 years or longer, and then they'd often leave. And the question is always, why did they leave? But there are many different theories, of course, but I don't know that we'll ever know exactly. And they didn't disappear because their descendants are there today in the American Southwest. They've just formed other groups.
And it has a bit of a Rough Rider connection here, too. So this is just east of Prescott, Arizona, which we know Bucky O'Neill, who was a captain of A Troop in the Rough Riders, was the mayor of Prescott and took an interest in this place, apparently. Thought it was worthy of protecting.
Yes.
I wasn't aware of that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, Douglas Brinkley mentions that in Wilderness Warrior about Bucky O'Neill.
I'm always looking for a Rough Rider tie-in. You know that.
Oh, yeah.
The third park that was established, and it was a monument then, it's Petrified Forest National Park today, But Petrified Forest National Monument, again, established the same day as the last two parks we discussed. It's an amazing place, too. They really all are. I love all of these Southwest parks so much. And I had an opportunity to work at Petrified Forest National Park for a short time on a special detail assignment. There had been a reorganization in the Park Service, and I went there to sort of sort that out in the Division of Interpretation. And so I got to spend a couple of months there living in the park and exploring on my own on my off time. And so it was a really great experience. And so there's so much petrified wood there. The logs are still in place, and then there's lots of pieces. And of course, like with the antiquities, a lot of that had been stolen in the past and occasionally still is, which is a problem. But the Park Service does its best to protect all of that from theft because it is really amazing. And everybody has really the right to see that part of our heritage. And so if someone takes it and puts it on their mantle, it deprives the rest of us from seeing it where it belongs, which is there on the ground in the park. Yeah. It's a very interesting park. It has 2 units. It's fairly large, but it's only open in the daytime. And you can probably figure out why that is. Because it's a better way to protect the petrified wood. Yes. It's in the daytime. And people can't come in as they can in many parks 24 hours a day.
And it's so just beautiful too, right? Just this
it really is.
Colors.
Yeah. There's the rainbow forest is there. Some people that think of it as the rainbow forest because they can see the colors in the rocks there. Yeah. As well as there's other fossils. There's dinosaur fossils, and then there's lots of these fossils of trees. And interestingly, every once in a while, there's someone that comes to the park and they expect to see a literal petrified forest, like with the trees standing, but they're petrified, and then they're disappointed. But most people aren't disappointed to visit there. It's really a great place. It does have a wilderness area too. And that's the only place where you can spend the night in the park. If you do want to backpack into the wilderness area, you can do that and be there overnight. But there's no developed campground or someplace for someone to park by the road or anything. It also preserves some other interesting things, like portions of Route 66 went right through there. The interstate goes through there now, and it sort of separates the 2 units of the park, the north unit and the south unit. But Route 66 went through there. So when I got to live there, I would ride my bike there on Route 66 and enjoy it and ride the road in the park as well, the main road, because it was a good way to see that park.
Just astonishing dark sky too, right?
Yes, pretty much so. There is an interstate nearby, but the nearest town of any size is some distance. So it's wide open spaces, true desert.
And I know we mentioned Representative John Lacey from Iowa before, but he was considered an expert on this park, and he believed it was one of the great natural wonders of the world.
So it's his pet project, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's what's interesting too. We've got, December of 1906, Lacey, who'd been in Congress for 3.5 decades, lost that election of 1906. So he knew by the time these got declared by Roosevelt, El Morro, Montezuma, Petrified Forest, that he wasn't going to be in the Congress in the upcoming session. So, it's just kind of a bitter pill to swallow, but he at least got through that massive piece of legislation, the Antiquities Act, before the Iowa voters booted him out of office.
Right. And then got to see some national monuments established before as well. And then, of course, in 1962, Petrified Forest became a national park by an act of Congress.
Well worth seeing.
The next national park we should probably discuss is Chaco Canyon. Chronologically, that one was declared a national monument by TR on March 11th, 1907. And it's now called Chaco Culture National Historical Park. So the name has been changed to better fit its designation, but the place is still the same. It's quite isolated in northwestern New Mexico. And unlike most of these national parks that I went to see through the Theodore Roosevelt lens, I had never been to Chaco, Most of the others I had been to, maybe all of the others, but this one I had not. And I was amazed. My best friend had worked there in 1978, and she'd told me about it. And that's kind of what started my National Park Service career.
Hmm.
It's because she told me she worked for a summer as a Student Conservation Association volunteer at Chaco. And I said, well, how do you get something like that? And so the next year I applied to be a Student Conservation Association volunteer at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And so if she hadn't told me about her time at Chaco, I might not have applied to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and my career might have
Wow.
not ever gone anywhere. So that's really what got me interested. I'd never been to Chaco, but just hearing about her experiences there as a volunteer park employee were enough to excite me about a career with the National Park Service, or at least starting out giving it a try. So
Yeah.
Chaco was always on my mind, but I'd never been there until recently. And I found it to be quite fascinating.
Yeah, we saw it a few years ago. I was not prepared for how extensive this place is, and it's just an amazing gem out there that's been preserved.
Of course, there are the ruins of the remnants of many ancient structures there, and it's very isolated. There are rough roads going into it. From the south, it's a rough dirt road that you can manage in a pickup, maybe a car, unless it rains, and then you might be out there for a while. And from the north, there's no pavement all the way to the park. There's 13 miles of dirt road. And so there are times when it's difficult to access, but it's very isolated. The roads are rough, and that means it's also very quiet, and it's also very dark. It's a dark sky park.
Trudy and I had the luxury of almost having the place to ourselves there the day that we visited in the middle of a weekday, and just stunning silence. And this is so worth going to visit if folks just don't know that area very well. It's worth finding your way to it. And I guess it's worth noting too, in 1987, this was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site as well. Just, I think, worthy.
I was amazed in the research on this, that how the Chacoan people, that they quarried the sandstone, they hauled the lumber from vast distances, and then eventually assembled largest buildings ever built in North America until the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. Incredible.
We call them great houses because they were multi-story buildings. It's really a cultural center, Chaco, and there was so much going on there, and so much trade going on from places very far away, and it's very complex. And I am not an anthropologist and no expert in that area at all, and so I really couldn't even describe what all happened there, and I leave that to the experts and to the native people who know. I just felt like I couldn't even write about it. I could only think of words. And so I had written at the time some words down, and it was ancient, extensive, amazing, mysterious, stark, dry, windy, remote, vast, important, quiet, dark, starry, and sacred. And those are the words I came up with, and I couldn't put them into any kind of sentences. The other one I would add is cold. There are a lot of temperature extremes at Chaco. It can be very hot there. But when I went, it was so cold. And I've lived much of my adult life in North and South Dakota. I don't know if I'd ever been so cold as I was at Chaco. And I camped for 2 nights in a tent with my little dog. And she was under like 3 layers of sleeping bags. And the first night I about froze. The second night, some friends left me one of their extra sleeping bags, and it wasn't so bad. But I had never, well, I have camped colder than that, I guess, but not in the desert Southwest. So it was quite a thing. And it was one of those things. I took a hike, and when I got back, my legs had been so numb that then they woke up and it hurt a lot. So it was an interesting place to be. And you have to be prepared for anything if you go there, because you are isolated. And you need to be prepared for that cold and also for hot, depending on when you're going. But it was a great place to see some wildlife as well. Every morning, very early, there was an alarm raven that woke us up in the campground. The alarm raven had a perch, and he made it his point to wake us up at a specific time each morning. So I really enjoyed it there, and I'm looking forward to a return trip for sure.
And you mentioned you couldn't write sentences about
No,
it, but I think your words spoke volumes, and somewhat like the book, The Perfect Tribute, that was written about Gettysburg Address. I think your words individually just capture it perfectly.
well, thank you. That's all I could do. Where shall we go next?
We're already in New Mexico. How about going to the cliff dwellings?
Yeah.
Okay, Gila Cliff Dwellings. Another interesting place. You know, there is a theme here. We say that about all of these places. Oh, it's a really great place. It's a really interesting place. It's a beautiful place. Or it was Lacey's favorite, or it was Theodore Roosevelt's favorite. And doesn't that say something in itself? That all of
Yes.
these national park areas, whether they're national parks or monuments or historic sites, are an amazing example of whatever they are. And that's what a national park should be. It should be one of the best examples of something that's important to our heritage in this country and the heritage of all of us. And so, yeah, we may say that a lot, that this is an amazing place, but that's how national parks are. All 433 have something amazing about them.
Yeah.
So Gila Cliff Dwellings, yes, that's in southern New Mexico. And it is, again, a great place. It's 44 miles north of Silver City, New Mexico. And it takes at least 2 hours to get there. Well, maybe somebody does it faster, but if I had gone faster than that, I would have been dizzy. The road is very slow and very windy, uphill.
Mm-hmm.
And it is generally considered to be a 2-hour journey for that 44 miles to get there. And then it's a walk to get to the actual Gila Cliff Dwellings. And Gila Cliff Dwellings is right in the middle of the Gila National Forest, which of course is managed by the U.S. Forest Service, and the Gila Wilderness, which is very significant. It was the very first wilderness area in the United States, and also the very first designated wilderness area in the world. And it was designated in 1924 because Aldo Leopold pushed for that. And we didn't have a Wilderness Act until 1964. But in 1924, the Gila Wilderness was established. And so Gila Cliff Dwellings is a Park Service site within the National Forest in the Gila Wilderness. So there's some cooperative management that goes on there. But these are amazing cliff dwellings that were built by the Tularosa Mogollon people. And they stayed in that area about 30 years is all. Now, there were other groups that lived there before. It's a good cliff that provides some protection so people could live there. And there's also water that goes through that area, a creek. And so that was available. So it was a good place to live. But right now, the park, for the most part, protects these cliff dwellings of those folks. The walk up to the cliff dwellings in Gila is a nice hike. It's not long, a couple of miles, but it's a beautiful place. And I recommend people visiting it, but they have to take enough time to drive there safely and walk a trail. It takes a day from wherever you start from nearby to see it properly, or to really see it at all.
Yeah, that's a couple hours west of White Sands, Alamogordo area, right? Or at least.
Yes, at least.
You got to be on your way there. I mean, it's not on the way to a lot of other places, so
Not at all.
Be
And
intentional.
Right, and the road from Silver City, it goes right between the Gila Wilderness and the Aldo Leopold Wilderness to get there. And so it's just surrounded by huge acreages of wilderness. And so it's one of the most remote sites, as far as not one of the most remote sites in the whole park system, because we have some that are very hard to get to in Alaska and other places. But it takes a long time by road to get to Gila cliff dwellings, but it's well worth it. I love it there.
And nearby at the headwaters of the Gila River was where Geronimo was born.
Oh,
So you have other ties with the region.
Which can be tied to the Rough Riders also.
Yes, it can.
With Leonard Wood and his time in the American Southwest. And earning the
Medal of Honor.
The Medal of Honor as part of that campaign.
Yeah.
Aren't you glad you knew that now, Valerie? All these
right,
Rough Rider tie-ins.
I've got that down. I have gone to Cuba to see the Rough Rider place, I guess, and to some other Rough Rider museums and such, but I'm not near as knowledgeable about all of the Rough Rider trivia that you are.
Where's our next stop?
Our next stop is Tonto National Monument in Arizona. You may want to start off with some things that you're aware of about that place.
Well, it's just outside of Phoenix, so you've got the Salt River that runs through that area. And again, a lot of Rough Riders were from that Phoenix area, and a number of Rough Riders were interested in water damming and conservation issues there. And so you had a big push for creating a reservoir.
Yeah. Right, and that was after Theodore Roosevelt passed the Reclamation Act in 1902, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
But they didn't build the reservoir yet. But in December of 1907, Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed Tonto National Monument in that same area. It was set aside to preserve the archaeological resources there of the Salado culture. And again, some cliff dwellings that are very impressive and beautiful and interesting and important to those folks. But it wasn't until later that they built the dam there and created Roosevelt Lake. So it's northeast of Phoenix. It's actually a ways. It's on the Mesa Roosevelt Road. This all gets kind of convoluted, but the Mesa Roosevelt Road is how they hauled all the things up there to build the dam to make Lake Roosevelt. And that's called the Apache Trail now. Most of our listeners will probably know that as the Apache Trail because it's pretty famous. And when Roosevelt went up there, he said the Apache Trail combines the grandeur of the Alps, the glory of the Rockies, the magnificence of the Grand Canyon, and then adds an indefinable something that none of the others have. To me, it is most awe-inspiring and sublimely beautiful. So he loved that road too. And many visitors today drive that road. It's a rough road in places, but they drive it just for that experience. And it is quite spectacular. But Roosevelt set aside these cliff dwellings as Tonto National Monument back in 1907. And then they started building the dam a little bit after that, I think. It was in
1911.
Well, it was finished there, So it all kind of happened simultaneously. So in 1903, they built that road, the Apache Trail, or the Mesa Roosevelt Road. And that the town of Roosevelt was established for the workers who were building the dam. And so around that time, there were 2,000 residents in the town of Roosevelt. And those were the people working on the dam. And eventually, once the water built up, it submerged that town, but they moved it a little bit up the road. So there still is a Roosevelt, Arizona, but instead of 2,000 residents, now it has maybe 20, I think right around 20. It's pretty small. So Theodore Roosevelt visited the lake and the dam, and he was there to dedicate it. He was no longer president, but he went there on March 18th, 1911 to dedicate the dam.
Do we think that he visited the national monument that he created?
He didn't. And I think it's well established that he did not. But yet it is not very far from the dam or from the lake. And so the question on many people's minds is, why didn't he stop and see this beautiful place that I know he would have enjoyed? He loved the Apache Trail. But the best thing that I've been able to come up with by talking to someone who talked to a descendant of the person that drove Roosevelt is that he really didn't have a chance. He had handlers. So someone drove him up the Apache Trail, and
Yeah.
they took him to the dam, and they had the ceremony, and they had to turn on the lights, and he had to flip a switch, and all these things that had to happen. And then it was dark. These ceremonies went on till after 10 p.m. And then the next day they picked him up and took him back down.
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of interesting because sneaking away from something official was something he was pretty good at. If you think about it, in Panama, he did
Yep.
that. Let's
Yep.
see.
Got away from some of the dinners to go operate the steam shovel. Yes.
Right. And he did that some other places too, I think in Yosemite. And then even in Edgemont, South Dakota, he went there by train, and
Yeah.
he was supposed to eat supper. All these ladies from the small town of Edgemont had prepared their very best meal. And he went and ate with some cowboys at a chuck wagon and didn't eat in the official dining area at all. So I don't know why he didn't sneak away to see Tonto National Monument, but he didn't on this one. And that will forever remain a mystery. But I think it is fair to say that he was, as a past president, he was being handled pretty closely, and he didn't have the opportunity really to get away in the short time he was there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I looked for in some of the writings. I couldn't find it to see if he had written anyone regrets that he missed seeing some of these sites. But when we talked in the last the part one of this series, where he wasn't able to get up and spend the time around Olympic when it was so close, and surely there was a lot of these regrets that he must have had when he was so close.
Oh, I know one other type of TR to the area, the prehistoric Salado pottery that was found in the cliff dwellings. The Harvard archaeologists, it's the red, black, and white geometric pattern pottery. They called it Roosevelt redware. So he didn't go
Interesting.
visit. Yeah, he didn't visit where the pottery was named after him. So
Well, of all of these parks and monuments, the one where his name is still very
yeah,
obvious is at Tonto, or around Tonto. Not really so much in the monument itself.
You
town.
drive on
Yeah,
the Roosevelt Road through the town of Roosevelt to get to Roosevelt Dam
Roosevelt.
to overlook
Hmm.
Roosevelt Lake that was created. Yeah.
Exactly. So he's still there pretty
Pick
much. And then
yourself
his,
up some Roosevelt pottery.
yeah,
Yes,
I hope not. I hope not. But
reproduction.
but certainly, yeah, there's a lot of Roosevelt in that area, and he did like that area, so that's great.
Yeah.
He had a lot of favorites, didn't he? A lot of places
Yes.
where he says it's the greatest, the best. His favorite bird, there's a number of those. There's favorite areas, the most beautiful place. A lot of superlatives in Roosevelt's world.
So where do we stop next on our tour?
How about Tumacácori, Arizona?
I was wondering how to pronounce that.
Tumacácori, Theodore Roosevelt declared that a national monument on September 15th of 1908. At that time, it was 9 acres and a mission church. And a very important one, as mission churches go, because it was established by Padre Kino. Father Kino is very well known in history. He was a Jesuit, and he established 20 missions in Arizona, many of which are around today. And so he had great influence in Arizona and northern Mexico during his time. This one, I believe, was established in 1691, so it's a very old church.
Yeah.
Father Kino was a priest, he was an explorer, he was a geographer, a scientist, and a writer. And he shaped a lot of modern Arizona and northern Mexico with what he did. And so Tumacácori was his first mission church. It was later run by the Franciscans. And the Adam people, the Yaqui people, and the Apache people were associated there with the mission until 1848 when everybody left.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those relationships were not always positive. There was a lot of strife there. There were some clashes. So there were both positive and negative influences from the mission, and positive and negative interactions with the native people there. But the church is well preserved, and it's fascinating to visit. And there's some other areas that have been added since Theodore Roosevelt's proclamation to include in a couple of other significant sites.
And you've been to this one too?
Yeah, I've been there several times, actually. It's
almost in Mexico, right?
It's 18 miles north of the border. I did work at Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, which is right on the border, but further west for a while. And so I was able to go over to Tumacácori. And of course, I went over there more recently to see it through Theodore Roosevelt's eyes. Mm-hmm. It was redesignated a National Historic Park in 1990, so it has a different name now. It's not a national monument. But I also did a kind of a goofy thing in 1986. A very young friend of mine who was a Mexican citizen and we took off on this road trip, and we went to Magdalena, Sonora, in my car, the two of us, to see the bones of Padre Quino, because Padre Quino's bones are in a mausoleum in the town of Magdalena. And I'm not sure why at that point I really wanted to see that, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. So we took off and went down there for the day. It was quite a ways, and saw the bones of Padre Quino. Very important site to a lot of people. A lot of people visit his bones or pilgrimages there. But it's in a glass crypt. He died in 1711 there. So his bones have been there a very long time.
And that's right off a fairly significant highway, right? Going into Mexico.
It's not an isolated place.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a long day trip.
I'm sure.
So Tumacácori is a good place to visit. And if anybody likes birds, it's also a place in southern Arizona, close to the Mexican border, where there are often rare bird species. So that vicinity is an interesting place to visit too. So many of our national parks and monuments are in places that also have a lot of other, I don't want to say the word attraction, but a lot of other important natural and cultural places around as well.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of takes us through all of these Southwestern cultural sites that were set aside as historic or prehistoric structures. And then we come to an area of what Roosevelt considered scientific interest. For a number of years, the citizens of the territory of Arizona, it wasn't yet a state, were filing mining claims for the Grand Canyon. They were running sheep and cattle through the Grand Canyon. There was a lot of interest from the railroads to develop the area and start building structures all around the rim of the Grand Canyon.
Yeah. And so there was certainly discussion about making it a national park. Theodore Roosevelt first went there on his 1903 Western Loop trip, correct?
It's the first time Roosevelt has ever seen the Grand Canyon. He's read about this place since he was a kid. He's read about John Wesley Powell's travels and explorations through the area from the mid-1800s. So he arrives there, and Roosevelt, of all people, is awestruck, maybe at a loss for words, gathers himself, and then is supposed to have said, I want to ask you, the people of Arizona, there to do one thing. In your interest, in the interest of the country, keep this great wonder of nature as it now is. I hope that you won't have a building of any kind to mar the grandeur of the sublimity of the canyon. You cannot improve upon it. The ages have been at work upon it, and man can only mar it. Keep it for your children and your children's children as one of the great sights that every American should see. Wow.
That's often quoted, or portions of that.
Yes.
Profound, for sure. He certainly recognized how important it was, but Congress would not make it a national park. The same reason that it's often an issue today is conflicts with mining and agricultural interests and such. And I like to think of things as not being so much complex conflicts, but just ways that you can work something out when there's something very important to protect. And so Congress wouldn't make it a national park, so Roosevelt proclaimed it a national monument. And
And
let's see,
established it as a
yeah,
game preserve. That's the best part. He starts it as a game preserve in November of '06, and then a national monument about a year later. So
yeah, in January of 1908, he made it a national
yeah,
monument. So
So rather than conservation efforts here, we're talking Roosevelt really understood that this needed to be preservation, right?
yes,
I think so. And a lot of these small sites that he proclaimed as national monuments as well preserve those antiquities
yes,
that were there. So the Antiquities Act allowed him to make that national monument. It was large, and that was really the very early prerequisite for some of the larger national monuments that we have today. Sometimes people will complain that presidents are setting aside areas that are larger than they need to be or whatever. But I don't think that's really true, because sometimes to protect something, you have to protect what's around it as well.
yes,
And we've talked about this a little bit before. For example, and this is off of this topic a little, but I used to work at Scotts Bluff National Monument, and we were supposed to protect the views of and from the bluff. But when that was established in 1918, it was a long ways from town, but now the town is right up to the border. And so you have to think a little beyond 2 miles to think about something that you're going to preserve. So when you look at the
yeah,
Grand Canyon, of course, it is in itself massive, but it needs some area around it to protect it as it should be, for the views,
yes,
for the ecology, the environment of the area, for the wildlife, and for the humans that want to go there to enjoy it.
yeah,
So Roosevelt did the right thing, and I doubt there are very many people today that wouldn't agree that we need to have the Grand Canyon preserved. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, it became a national park later and has been changed in acreage a little bit. That's true for a lot of these parks and monuments. The acreage changes, not often by a lot, but sometimes
yeah,
when a designation is changed, they may add a few acres or adjust a boundary here and there. Sometimes they add a lot, but
yeah,
Congress has the right to do that.
So Roosevelt understood that unless something was done, and again, this is in his last year as president, and he probably understood if he didn't do this action to protect it, then very likely it would be opened up to just countless mining claims, and it would be turned into the largest strip mining operation in the
mm,
world, and then it would be a mess, and there's no going back. And so over 800,000 acres he set
yeah,
aside, which is larger than some New England states. It's just dumbfounding the size of this proclamation. But I think he knew in his mind and his heart that Congress would eventually get around to declaring this a national park.
And it didn't take very long, I don't believe, did it? Until
No, it
it
didn't.
was established as a national park. So
became that in 1919. Yeah,
right, 1919. So it didn't really take very long. And of course, there are millions of visitors to the Grand Canyon, and it's one of the most popular national parks in the country
yeah,
today.
So I have my favorites parts of the Grand Canyon, and a lot of it has to do with the North Rim, which is much less
mm,
visited.
yes, more wild. Yeah,
Is it because that's where Roosevelt Point is?
That just happens to be on the North Rim as well. I guess you're right. Wow, I hadn't really thought about that, Valerie. Yeah.
It is. I specifically went there. I do this work of going to Roosevelt's Park for the Theodore Roosevelt Center at Dickinson State University in North Dakota. And my project over the last few years has been to go to all of the national parks and monuments that Theodore Roosevelt established, of which there are 18 monuments and 5 national parks. And so 23 areas. So I have been to 22 of those officially. And the only one I haven't been to officially is Grand Canyon. And I have an appointment in about a month from today.
Wow.
mm,
So that will be my last of the parks. But of course, I've been
wow,
to the Grand Canyon several times, and I did take it upon myself to visit the North Unit here fairly recently. And I went to Roosevelt Point, which of course is named for Theodore Roosevelt, and it has beautiful views from the North Rim. The North Rim is closed in the winter, and it's not open all year. And I was there towards the end of the season, But it was great to visit the North Rim again because I had not been there since I was a child. When I go in March, there may be even some snow or wintry weather. It's possible. I'm prepared for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We went a few years ago in February, and that was a great time. You need some ice crampons if you're going to go down the trail a bit. But yeah, that's a wonderful time because it's so little visited during that time.
I'm going to be buried in the archives, I think, and that'll be okay because I know that they have some important papers relating to Theodore Roosevelt at Grand Canyon.
What do you
Some
hope
of
to
the
find,
parks
Valerie?
that, well, anything that's related to Theodore Roosevelt or the establishment of the National Monument primarily, or the establishment of the game preserve, anything that relates to Theodore Roosevelt. So Grand Canyon, of course, is very organized, so they have a printout of things that are related to Theodore Roosevelt. But I usually go a little deeper and look for archives that may be more peripherally related, but still very important to the Theodore Roosevelt Center, because we want to capture everything digitally about Theodore Roosevelt. So scholars like yourself and students and others can go and find that information in an accessible place online. So I'll be there to see what the Grand Canyon has. I already know they've got a good number of documents, and maybe I'll find even more while I'm there. So I've allowed a couple of days to go through things and see. This is what I do at all of these parks, and some of the parks don't have anything. And I visit and find out they don't have anything, which is fine. That's why I'm there. Then it won't have to be repeated by someone else saying, I wonder if there's something at Tonto.
Yeah.
So I always make a visit and I always talk to the curators. And I always, if they do have any archives at all on site, and they don't always, I always go through and looked at first things that they may not realize are related to Theodore Roosevelt, but they are. So I can be very thorough with that sometimes. And it's always great working with the various curators and museum technicians at all of these national parks that Roosevelt established. I've been doing it for quite a few years now, and it's coming to an end because Grand Canyon is number 23 of the 23 parks that Roosevelt established. So I finished this project with all the other parks. I specifically left Grand Canyon for last because I knew it would be complex and large and much more difficult to do than some of the others. But it's amazing which parks have more archives than others and which parks have more things related to Roosevelt than others. It's not always what you might think.
Yeah.
So we'll see. So that one's coming up in a month.
Wonderful.
Wow.
I think we probably speak for everybody out there in the community that
Yes.
say we're really grateful that you've done that legwork.
Very much.
And to the TR Center
Yes.
in Dickinson that it's going to be made available to everyone.
Right. And a lot of the documents that I have found are online already. Most of them are. And so you can find all of those that some of which are also found other places, but many that are not, that were unique to the park collections are online at TheodoreRooseveltCenter.org. So it's a good place to go to find anything you want to find about Theodore Roosevelt. And the collection is growing all the time.
Yes, it is a wonderful resource.
I think on our website for this episode, we'll post some links to the TR Center and your blog posts that you've written for the TR Center over the years as you visited these various sites related to Roosevelt.
There have been quite a few blogs, more blogs than sites, because I've thrown in a couple of extra ones about frustrations, for example, during the COVID pandemic when I couldn't go anywhere. And a traveler like I am, it was very hard to not visit parks during that time. And I threw in a couple of extra parks that were sort of related. For example, Redwood National Park didn't really have anything to do with Theodore Roosevelt, but all of the collections from Lassen Volcanic are stored there. And so when you go there, you realize that, it didn't have anything directly having to do with Theodore Roosevelt, but it did in a way, because he did talk about preservation of redwoods being important.
Yeah.
And preserved redwoods at Muir Woods. And then the Roosevelt elk were running around there at the redwood. So, it's amazing how you find things related to Roosevelt wherever you go, particularly in the Western U.S.
Yeah, his fingerprints are all over the West. They really are.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Valerie, thank you so much for being with us for this episode. We've
it's
really
always
enjoyed
fun.
this.
And the next one I think we're going to do is mountains and plains, correct?
Well, that would theoretically bring in all of the remaining TR parks and monuments into a final episode if we did that, right?
I don't know if it'll be our final episode, but maybe the last one of this series of going through the Theodore Roosevelt parks one by one.
Okay, good point. I hope it's not the final
Yes.
time that we have you on the podcast. But yeah, that would be the final part of the TR's Parks series with Valerie Naylor. So looking forward to the next one. So thanks again so much.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Well, that's our show for today. Thanks for listening.
Remember, you can find this podcast on our website, www.talkaboutteddy.com. You can also see our show notes and links to TR resources and books that were mentioned in the podcast.
And if you've enjoyed our content, please do consider subscribing and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and family about us, because it really does make a difference and it helps others find this show.
And if you feel like supporting us, you can now go to buymeacoffee.com/talkaboutteddy.
Or simply click on the yellow coffee cup icon on our website, talkaboutteddy.com.
So we hope you'll join us for the next episode of Talk About Teddy. And as our dear friend Colonel Roosevelt would say,
do what you can with what you've got where you are.
Bully!